Howdy, y'all. You're listening to The Fixed Star. I'm Jacob David Glenn. Today I'm going to be joined by David L. Hudson Jr. If it's your first time with us, The Fixed Star is a project investigating free thought. We do this by looking at legal cases and issues with a particular focus on the First Amendment. We analyze current popular political and social happenings, and we also tackle theological and philosophical questions. If you enjoy the discussion, please subscribe or leave us a review. And if you'd like to check out some more of our writings, including articles and essays, please visit thefixedstar.com. Today, this week, we consider what insights the art form of jazz can provide for a society that wishes to uphold free thought principles. And in so doing, we take a moment to reflect on the work of Nat Hentoff. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoy. So this week we're going to be jumping through an essay that I wrote. This essay was for a submission for a Cato Institute event that was based on the following prompt, which are words written by Nat Hentoff. And David, in a moment, is going to tell us a bit more about Mr. Hentoff, the late great. But he once cautioned, a precedent has been set out of all places, colleges and universities, that the principle of free speech is merely situational. Once speech can be limited in such subjective ways, more and more expression will be included in what is forbidden. And the prompt was just to respond to that in, I think, less than 700 words, so pretty short. But it was very auspiciously and interestingly timed because I was given this book right here by David, who I was serving as his research assistant at the time, focusing almost exclusively on First Amendment stuff. And he just coincidentally, providentially, perhaps, if you're inclined to view the world that way, handed me this book, Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee, which is by Nat Hentoff. And this was written, or excuse me, he handed this to me probably 6 weeks before I got the information about this event. So I've been pouring through this book and really got a lot out of it. And also, he was an author who wrote a lot about jazz. So having this prompt, some things kind of coalesced to force me to think, the stars aligned, you might say, to force me to consider what we're going to talk about today, which is this analogy and this comparison of jazz, the art form, particularly from the perspective of the musician themselves and how you approach it, to free thought, what is often referred to as the classical liberal society. But before I really expand on that idea and the specifics of what I want to talk about, I think it would be great to have David give us some insight on the work on this book, but then also the works generally of Nat Hentoff and what he was about as a background before we jump in. And that'll inform a little bit of the things I'm going to say in this essay, and we're going to discuss it and bounce some ideas back and forth. But so David, without further ado, if you want to give us some insight, I think we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so Nat Hentoff really was an American legend. He was a journalist of the first order. He was a columnist for the Village Voice from 1958 to 2010. His column was syndicated in newspapers across the country. He wrote for the Washington Post. He wrote for a variety of newspapers. He was someone who spent a great deal of time writing about jazz. He wrote for the publication Downbeat. He knew Dizzy Gillespie. He knew Miles Davis. He knew a lot of the leading jazz artists. But in addition to being a connoisseur of jazz, Nat Hentoff was a fierce defender of the Bill of Rights. He was an individual above all else. You couldn't really pigeonhole him into classic liberal or classic conservative. He was fervently pro-life, and he was an atheist. And he didn't see any dichotomy between those two, and he was very adamant about both those positions. But how I knew Nat Hentoff, and I did get to know him personally, is through reading his work about the First Amendment. As I said, he was a fierce defender of the Bill of Rights, but his favorite part of the Bill of Rights was the first 45 words. And there are two books that I still recommend to virtually anybody that cares about the First Amendment. The first one is a book that Nat Hentoff had published in 1980 called The First Freedom: The Tumultuous History of Free Speech. Just an excellent work in general about the history of the First Amendment and a lot of leading controversies. And then the book that Jacob showed you all, which was published in 1993, Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee: How the American Left and Right Relentlessly Censor Each Other. He also wrote books about how to be an authentic American, living the Bill of Rights. He had a memoir that came out, I think, in 1997 called Speaking Freely. I knew him because when I was doing work at the First Amendment Center, out of the blue, I got a phone call complimenting me on one of my online articles for the First Amendment Center. And he proceeded to tell me how much he enjoyed the piece and asked me to send him some of my other work. And of course, I was thrilled because I was a big fan of Nat Hentoff. And later, he actually wrote the foreword to a 2-volume set that I edited called the Encyclopedia of the Fourth Amendment, which is the amendment that protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. But 2 points about Nat Hentoff. He was very much against hate crimes. He felt that when the government passed laws legislating hate, that was in effect the government engaging in a form of thought control. So, for example, in many states, there are hate crimes laws that are what we call penalty enhancement laws. So that, let's say that the typical offense for assault is 5 years, you might get 3 more years if you assaulted your victim because of the victim's race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. And Nat Hentoff's point was that you should punish people who commit crimes if the prosecution can prove all the elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. But you shouldn't be punishing people simply because they hold bigoted thoughts. That freedom of thought is the essence of a free society. He also was someone who was very much against some of the excesses that occurred after the awful terrorist attacks on 9/11, September 11th, 2001. For those that are too young to remember that, only 45 days after 9/11, the United States Congress passed the United in Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism, better known by its acronym, the USA Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act was a 342-page law that amended 17 different federal laws. And a lot of them simply gave government too much power to encroach upon our freedoms, particularly our Fourth and First Amendment freedoms. And Nat Hentoff referred to that as a war on our Bill of Rights. And he was as fierce a defender of those individual freedoms as anyone that I've encountered. I've been in the First Amendment world since 1995. And I can tell you, I know of no finer works than the First Freedom and Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee. And I don't know of any person who was so consistent in their opposition to censorship, no matter where it fell along the political spectrum. And for that, I think he deserves to be lionized as a First Amendment hero.
So thanks for that synopsis, man. That's a great overview. And to those listening, so when I spent time as David, Professor Hudson at that time, as his research assistant, we'd meet in the office or in the library occasionally, but maybe most often at the pool hall, and we would discuss these things. And so when he gave me this book, as I was reading through free, and this actually is the actual copy you gave me, I still have here, but we would be discussing ideas, kind of an unusual research assistant relationship, because we'd have a more casual environment to discuss these ideas and discuss the things he's putting forth in this book.
As I recall, you sort of did what you wanted to.
Yeah, it was
sort of inverted the paradigm of what a research assistant is supposed to do.
Well,
that's okay.
Yeah, it all worked out in the end. But anyway, Um, so it was interestingly timed that I had the opportunity to be a part of this event where there was an essay prompt based on this because it came right as we were talking about a lot of the things David just shared with us right now. So, as I mentioned in our second episode, I'm a musician as well. And so when I got this prompt based on Hentoff, I immediately thought, well, let me consider how jazz might be a topic that would serve as a useful foil or a useful counterpoint to help illustrate, to help generate a response to this essay. And so I thought about some things that are significant about free thought generally, about the kind of principles that undergird the First Amendment, the guideposts that the First Amendment sets up that help us move towards truth. Presumably, theoretically, that's what it is meant to do. So one of the first things I thought about was the way jazz intrinsically has a reverence for tradition. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you do what has traditionally been done for its own sake and don't think about it. But it does necessitate that people who are going to engage in the medium have to take time to respect, to learn, understand, and have some degree of respect for the tradition into which they're stepping. So, one thing about jazz, and this isn't actually only true of jazz, this would be true of if you're in kind of the Latin American world, if you're in the blues world, even in the rock and roll world, there's certain songs, if you're going to go to a gig, if you're going to go sit in, you have to know these tunes. Like you have to know a certain core group of what in the jazz world they call them standards because they are standard knowledge. And when you go, you're meant to understand these. So you sit in and you have a common language, a common base of knowledge that everyone involved can engage in dialogue about, and in a context in which they can coexist and have some already understood commonalities, so you don't have to rebuild from the ground up every time. Now, in the second episode, when we talked about style over substance, I mentioned how a lot of the jazz, the approach to a jazz gig is you play the head of the tune, the theme, the recognizable melody, and then each player interprets that on the way through, and then you end up and you hit the melody one more time, the head one more time. But each player has to be, when it's not their turn for the interpretation, they have to be facilitating the person who's doing the interpretation. You have to be facilitating and allowing them their space, allowing them that place to move. So I thought about that as a reverence for tradition, a respect for the liturgy would be another way to think about it. And in the world of the First Amendment, in the world of debate as we have in this country, in the world of free thought, we have to allow others the opportunity to present their ideas. We don't say, you know what, no, that's not allowed. It would be to try to suppress an idea in the liturgy of music would be akin to when someone else is taking a solo, looking at, so say the guitar player is going to take a solo, it would be like the horn section saying, hey, we're just going to play nonsense really loud over this person so they can't be heard, if you want to think about it that way. So there are, in the world of discussion and ideas, we have to, even if, so to go back to the musician analogy, even if there's someone who you hate the way they play, you hate how they emphasize everything, in the conversation, we have to give them their thought and then let the audience be the judge of whether they dig it or whether it doesn't move them. In the world of conversation, the world of examining an idea to weigh it for its merits, we don't silence it. We don't invoke the Hecklers Veto would be an example where you just drown out. And maybe David could give us some insight on that in one moment. But you don't just drown out an opinion. Rather, you allow the opinion to be brought forth and you allow the hearers to gauge for themselves. So similarly to how in that second episode I mentioned, jazz puts some impetus, it places some responsibility on the listeners. So does a society that presumes to have free speech, that presumes to have free thought. You give your audience the responsibility, the burden of having the responsibility of weighing the ideas and considering them for themselves. And you have to trust that they're just not going to take whatever wholesale, that they're going to use some critical thinking so that you don't have to say what they are or are not capable of hearing. And David, could you actually give us some insight on the Heckler's veto, generally what it is? So I just brought that.
Yeah, Heckler's veto is a concept where some unruly listeners can drown out the speaker. So a classic case where the Heckler's veto prevailed was a case called Feiner versus New York, 1952, where a student from Syracuse University, who was a former veteran, Irvin Feiner, was giving a speech on a soapbox on a street corner, and he was talking about the fact that he felt that African Americans needed to rise up and protest for equal rights in society. And there were a lot of people in the crowd who were very much adamantly opposed to what Feiner was saying, and they essentially shouted him down. And when the police came, instead of regulating the raucous mob, they end up arresting Irvin Feiner and charging him with disorderly conduct. That's where the Heckler's veto prevailed. So the Heckler's veto is a concept that allows unruly speakers to diminish the free speech rights of the speaker. And that's unfortunate in a free society, right? Because if a speaker is peaceful, no matter how noxious their ideas are, we give a presumption that that speech should be protected. As Jacob said, we don't. Our first response should not be to censor or disallow speech. Our first response should be to allow that speech to enter the marketplace of ideas and then let it be judged on its merits or lack thereof.
And so that I think that's what where you just ended is really the point, is because it's not that we want the speech to be, or the marketplace of ideas theory is you don't want the speech to be allowed a microphone for its protection. Rather, it's quite the opposite. You want certain ideas put in a microphone in front of a microphone for them to be completely nude, naked, unprotected, so you can see them, and you want everyone to have the opportunity. You want to have that opportunity for the Q&A after the speech, so everyone can start try and poke holes in the theory that's presented. And another aspect of that essay, that comparison between jazz and between, well, I suppose this would kind of apply to music generally, but there's also you notice a more mature musician when they approach a gig, a sit-in, a jam, a tune, and what they're trying to do is cater to the song, not to have the song cater to themselves. And that's something that, with my own playing and attitudes towards music, I found when I was younger, I would find myself just kind of waiting for the part where I get to go nuts. But now I'm a lot more chill and much more interested in facilitating something that everyone can dig, the audience really, and something that facilitating the other people, because you trust that they're going to give you that they're going to be there for you the same way. And so similarly with ideas, when we present ideas in a national conversation, it ought to be the case that the theoretical ideal America is a place where everyone listens to the presented ideas and gives them their due and engages with them in good faith. Of course, now I think we don't, I don't want to say broadly or just generally, although I guess that is actually what I'm saying, but we do have a large problem where it seems increasingly that people are unwilling to give that same consideration. Either they would just rather you know what, I'm not interested in hearing that. Let's just cut that off.
It is what Hentoff said in his title, right? Free speech for me, but not for thee.
Exactly.
People that operate in that thing. And you won't say it, but I'll say it. You won first prize for that essay as well. You should have. And I think hopefully it'll go on the Fixed Star website. But I think one of the geniuses behind the piece that you wrote was that it epitomized Nat Hentoff to his core, right? This was a guy who's arguably two of the biggest passions in his entire life were jazz and the First Amendment. And, to tie them together and make these, connections that you did, I thought was, genius. I thought if Nat Hentoff was alive, he would have really applauded it himself,
Well, I appreciate that. One other thing I guess I'll mention, and maybe this will be a good wrapping up thought for us, was in that process. And again, I wouldn't speak so highly of my thought process behind it. Rather, I would say that things aligned from. I was just in. I was the right that prompt forced me to the right combination of thoughts, and among those, I was considering things I've heard in the world of music, and then considering things I've heard that we've talked about a lot. And one really interesting saying that I bet a bunch of people here who are hearing will have heard before, but that's very a common little inside joke amongst musicians, particularly jazz oriented musicians, is that the saying is jazz musicians play a million notes for a few people, and pop musicians play a few notes for millions of people. And one can debate the various merits of those two worlds, and you can talk endlessly about a lot of things implicated by that saying. But I think most people would agree there's a, a serious or a significant degree of truth in that statement. But what if that's the case for our free thought principles? What if it becomes the case where increasingly and increasingly the things that aren't already popular are thrown by the wayside and increasingly regarded as unworthy of being given the chance to be heard? I see that happen with some jazz gigs, and we mentioned on our second episode. You asked me about that guitar player at the cigar shop, and he's kind of playing background noise. That's sort of the deal with the gig. It's a solo guitar, but you asked me if this guy's good, and I said actually that's among the best guitar players I've seen in Nashville. Like the guy's truly gifted, but a lot of people aren't going to see it that way because they're not primed to. Maybe the context isn't right. A whole host of factors. Similarly, with music. Oh, and the one addendum I would make to that is that it requires a willingness to look and hear a person in a context that perhaps he's in the corner meant to be background noise, but it require you to look and consider, wow, maybe this guy is actually truly amazing. Because I think that guy was really truly amazing. But also, it takes some work to break down that barrier of this is a background noise thing happening here. It doesn't have the glitz and glam, the big lights. It doesn't, it's not primed to think, wow, this is really amazing. Similarly, there's a lot of ideas, thoughts, solutions to problems we have that aren't at the forefront, that maybe take some digging to find, that maybe take some work. But that's our natural inclination is not to do that. Our natural inclination is to see the person who looks like a trustworthy politician and think that's a trustworthy politician, or see the person who looks like the expert and think, hey, they must be an expert because a bunch of other people say they're an expert. And this is certainly to anyone listening right now. I and David are not suggesting we are these pillars of these great examples of looking beyond the veils of intended perceptions, because that's certainly not the case. I think we're all subject to them. But I do think that the pillar, the foundational ideas of our society calls us to be those people who don't say, I'm going to believe what's already believed. It calls us to engage. It calls us beyond the free speech for me, but not for thee. And to say, we have to listen because there could be some genius idea, some solution to our problem. If only we would listen, if only we would just say, no, we've never done it that way. No one does it that way. We can't even consider that. And I guess I fear some things a lot of people who are in the jazz and the high music world, you might say, fear about the future of that area of music could also be feared for in the way we approach thought. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. And David, if you have anything else?
No, I just look forward to reading that essay on the fixed star and enjoy the conversation. And I really think anyone who's interested in reading more about free thought and the First Amendment really ought to check out the name Nat Hentoff.
Absolutely. And on the Fixed Star, obviously the name of the podcast, but we are very close to having our website up. So very soon after the posting of this podcast, you should be able to check out thefixedstar.com and various essays we've talked about. Some that we have yet to talk about are going to be posted up, written by David Sam Bass, who's not with us today, and myself will be up there. And we look forward to diving into some more of these ideas with y'all soon. Thanks for taking the time to listen, David. As always, great
Thank
chatting
you.
with you, and we'll see everyone next week.
Right.